us today. We are very excited to host you today for the Touchstones of Hope series, and this one is non-discrimination. I am just going to go over some general Zoom functions and a little breakdown of what our agenda looks like today, and then I will pass it off to our moderator. So, as many of you are probably aware, we have the mute and unmute functions in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You can stay on mute for the majority of the time. There will be a Q&A at the end if you would like to unmute. And we encourage you to have your video on if you'd like. If not, that's okay too. And you can find that function also in the left-hand bottom corner of your screen where it says stop or start video. You can also view the participant list. There's a 2 people icon at the bottom of your screen as well. And then you will see on the right-hand side all of the participants. We're at about 58 right now. And you can also open up the chat. So that will be a great way to connect with everyone, ask questions, see information that our moderators and others will be posting in there. And again, that's at the bottom of your screen and it will pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. Thank you for those who are already letting us know where they're coming from. That's always great to see. If you'd like to rename yourself, so if you do a Q&A, then we can address you by name. You can do that by clicking on participants and then your name and clicking rename, and then you can press OK to save that. And there's also reactions at the bottom of your screen that you could use if you would like to participate in that way. And finally, we have the speaker versus gallery view. And you'll see that at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Right now, this is the gallery view where you can see everyone. And finally, I would just like to let you know what our agenda looks like today. So we will be doing a 1-hour panel, about 20 minutes for each panelist. Then we will have an audience Q&A for 20 minutes at the end and some closing remarks for about 5 minutes at the very end. So we're scheduled to go until 11:30 Pacific time or 2:30 Eastern time. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to being in this conversation with you. I'm going to pass it off to our moderator, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much, Betty. Wache Misawe, Shwebanish Nishnakasun. My name is Jocelyn Formsma. I am originally from Moose Cree First Nation, grew up in Northern Ontario, and I currently call the unceded Algonquin Territory my home, which is in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada's capital. Just as everybody is welcoming and saying hello in the chat, I'm already quite pleased and overwhelmed to see that we have visitors coming from all corners of Turtle Island, at least one person from New Zealand, and it's wonderful that we can gather here virtually, even if we cannot gather together in person. I am the Executive Director of the National Association of Friendship Centers. We operate over 100 local and provincial territorial associations across Canada, providing program services, community and cultural connections for Indigenous people living in urban settings all across Canada. And I am a board member of the National Indian Child Welfare Association and a former staff of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. About, well, more than 10 years ago now, started this journey on Touchstones, then as a youth representative with the mighty Cindy Blackstock, or Dr. Cindy Blackstock, as we'll hear from a little bit later, and as well as Terry Cross from NICWA. And this has been one of those enduring projects that you know, sometimes you do something and that was it, and it was a wonderful time. And this has been one of those projects that really has just come back time and time again. And the relevancy of the framework that we've created with Touchstones of Hope, it just blows me away how much this work continues to resonate, you know, more than a decade later. And I'm so happy and proud that I could support NICWA and I could support the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society in this series as a host for this Touchstones of Hope for children, youth, and families. Very proud to be back in this space. And so I want to spend as much time hearing from our esteemed speakers. Again, just a note, if you could keep yourself on mute as much as possible, listen in, and then we will have some opportunities for Q&A. And as things are going along, if you want to put your questions into the chat box, you're more than welcome to. And then we'll kind of start collecting that for when we do our Q&A. I will briefly go through each one of the bios right now, because as we're going through the transition, I want to spend again as much time hearing from these three esteemed speakers as possible, and less time listening to me read out all of the amazing work that they've done, and more time hearing directly from them. So first we'll have speaking Dr. Cindy Blackstock, member of the Gitxsan First Nation, who is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and a professor at McGill's University School of Social Work. She has over 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights and has published more than 75 articles. She's frequently cited in the company of the Caring Society's Reconciliation Ambassador, Spirit Bear, who engages children in meaningful actions to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Sometimes I get a little bit used to operating in a space and start using, acronyms that I forget not everybody has had the same access to. So Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission regarding the residential schools here in Canada. And I hear that the United States may be considering doing one of their own, and I would be very encouraged to hear that. And then we'll hear from Dr. Helaina Gaspard. She's a researcher, advisor, teacher, and convener, a co-founder of the IFSD. Maybe Helaina can explain that acronym for us, and works at the intersection of politics and public money and research and strategic engagements to deliver evidence and public policy outcomes. And then finally, we have Mr. Jack Trope, longtime friend of NICWA and currently the Senior Director in Indian Child Welfare Programs at Casey Family Programs, where he works on national and local initiatives aimed at promoting compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act, increasing tribal access to Title IV-E foster care and adoption assistance program, and improving child welfare outcomes for children and families in state and tribal systems through training and systems improvement. Previously, Jack has served as the Executive Director of the Association of American Indian Affairs for more than 13 years, and as a staff attorney earlier in his career. He's also served as director for the Albuquerque-based Western Area Office for Save the Children Federation and held a number of legal positions, including being a partner with the law firm of Santangelo and Trope. Mr. Trope has worked on Indian child welfare matters since 1985 and is a co-author of the 3rd edition of the Indian Child Welfare Act Handbook, published by the American Bar Association. So as you can tell from just these bios, you're in pretty good hands today. And just as a reminder, this is the 2nd dialogue in a series that is going to go over the next few months. And in particular, today we are talking about non-discrimination. So we went through our housekeeping items already. We talked a little bit about the dialogue series, which this is going to be going on until, I think, until the fall. We've got a number of series of conversations set up that is focused on each one of the touchstones. So I think, as I had mentioned, the Touchstones we had developed as a community-driven process, a ground-up process of developing a process and reconciliation guided by values. And each one of those values we're going to be highlighting in this series and have speakers that will speak to each one of those. So without further ado, and to make sure that we have lots of times for question and answer and some discussion, I will ask Cindy, can bring up her slides, and she will launch us into this wonderful conversation today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Great. It's so good to see you, Jocelyn, and to know that actually it's been 15 years since our Touchstones gathering, which I can't believe. And I think the durability of that really is owing to the over 300 persons from all over Turtle Island who participated and really surfaced these principles. And it wasn't surprising to many of us that one of the key principles that emerged was non-discrimination. I mean, it is so fundamental to people being able to live the lives they wish to have. It is threaded through every United Nations human rights treaty. And I want to make the argument today that so too often governments in particular like to bifurcate the idea of non-discrimination and self-determination as if they're two separate entities. And I want to make the argument they're actually the same thing. That if you have self-determination, particularly in being able to affirm your own laws, reaffirm your own laws as a First Nations, Métis or Inuit or Native American, Alaskan Native community, you need the resources in order to implement that. But even if you're working under a state or provincial system, the idea of substantive equality, that being equality that not only takes account of what everybody else gets, but it takes particular account of the situation that First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and Native American, Alaska Natives, and Hawaiians have experienced because of colonization, is absolutely critical to ensuring the health and well-being of kids. So let's go to the next slide. So the Touchstones of Hope really came out of a discussion where people were saying the child welfare system was broken and that there was attempts to make it culturally appropriate, but that didn't seem to go very far. And one of the things that we started to appreciate from our conversations with communities is that their collective vision of what it is for a healthy child and family in their community had often been fractured due to colonialism, particularly residential schools in Canada. And that we needed to create a mechanism for communities to re-envision what that collective vision looks like, reclaim it, and then to develop a pathway towards children's services that's built on children's well-being, that isn't siloed in the colonial construct of child welfare, but indeed really allows for those traditional laws to come forward. And so we, Andrea Auger, who's on this call, we have a whole toolkit on how to do this visioning, and then how to, from that visioning, to draw down your traditional laws and customs in your nation, and then to look at what the different types of things are that you need to be able to get there. So all of that is really, really important. The final keys that's absolutely key to it is how do you cost it out in a sustainable way? And I'm not going to be going through that in a lot of detail because we have our wonderful colleague, Helaina Gaspard, who has been working with First Nations all over Canada to really reformat child welfare from the funding mechanism, because where the money is, that really does often drive practice. So we'll just move on to the next slide. So this is a report that I was privileged to be a part of. It's a Pan American Health Organization report on health equity and inequity. And we're all very familiar with the determinants of health. My view on the determinants of health is that they are still from a Western construct, and they don't take a full accounting of the worldviews of First Nations, Métis or Inuit peoples. Nor do they really account for some of the structural drivers that get in the way of us realizing those determinants of health. And so I just want to put forward that this is a conceptual model that came out of the feedback of Indigenous peoples all over the Americas. And it has a couple of important points. Number one, you can see on the structural drivers that the land is there, not as separate from climate change, because I really view climate change as being a Western construct. It is when the land is a threat to you, versus for many Indigenous peoples, we are of the land, we are part of it. And so it's essential to being able to interpret the determinants of health. The other thing is that there's ongoing recognition of the structural racism and colonialism that gets in the way of us being able to live the lives we wish to have. And there's also within the document a real important emphasis on spirituality and that importance that it takes in our daily lives. So I just put that out there for reference for you. It's available in English, French, and Spanish. Next slide. So what provoked us into action? Well, you know, there's a long history in Canada where the government of Canada provides less money for First Nations children in public services than everybody else. This has been going on for decades, since Confederation, and it's been normalized. It's been normalized by the government for sure, who wants us to be grateful for these inequitable services. It was also really mythologically forecast into the public, who are told that First Nations not only get everything you get, but they get bonus services. And then unfortunately, it's also been normalized in our communities because they've never known anything else other than many communities not getting clean water, child welfare being underfunded, early childhood programs being underfunded, overcrowded housing. I know these are very familiar themes for folks in the US as well. And there's also, this has persisted because despite us having solutions, despite the government of Canada knowing about this inequality, and despite the government of Canada having solutions, it has persisted through the years, and we've ended up in this very unhealthy pattern of assuming the government isn't doing better because it doesn't know better. So we get involved in documenting the problem, again, making more recommendations that they ignore, and then they forget about it, and then we start the cycle all over again. What really helped interrupt that cycle for us is to really relocate our measurement of real change at the level of kids. And when we saw that between 1989 and 2017, these inequalities in child welfare, but also in other public services for First Nations, was driving children to be separated from their families at rates that exceeded anything that we've known in Canadian history. And that we thought about it not as, quote, overrepresentation, but we thought about it like kids think about it. Like, how many sleeps till I see my mom? What you're seeing there is Government of Canada data. And this is for on reserve only in Canada, which is kind of our equivalent of reservations for those of you in the US. And you can see between 1989 and 2017, First Nations kids spent over 78 million nights away from their families. That's over 213,000 years of childhood. So while we were waiting for Canada to implement the reports, this is what was unfolding on the ground. Next slide. So one of the reasons is, well, why is this happening? Well, it's all linked to a lot of those inequalities. The poverty, the poor housing, parental substance abuse linked to mental health challenges from residential schools and other forms of colonialism, and domestic violence. The good news about these things is that they can be addressed with culturally based services. The bad news, of course, is that the government was underfunding all of these things. Next slide. So this is one of the reports where we were in that cycle with Canada of documenting the problem with them and providing recommendations. And I just want to provide this to you just so that you were all really clear that the government of Canada's choices regarding First Nations children really were conscious choices. It wasn't that they failed to do something, it's that they chose to continue the discrimination. On the left, you can see a national policy review report. Well, that was done with Canada. And we found out that First Nations kids in child welfare got 78% cents on the dollar compared to other kids. And then when we did the more detailed report 5 years later, we found that because of inflation and government cutbacks, that number was now 70 cents on the dollar. So we were losing ground as we were doing these studies with the government. Next slide, please. So that prompted the Assembly of First Nations, which is our political national body, and a caring society, to have a courageous conversation, not only with Canada, but most importantly with ourselves, which is, what are we prepared to risk to stop this? It was clear the cycle of reports with recommendations was not going to do it. So what we decided to do is file a human rights complaint against the Canadian government, alleging that these inequalities amounted to racial discrimination contrary to the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, the government took immediate action, and that immediate action was to cut all the funding for the Caring Society. So up until now, we are completely non-government funded, which we actually kind of like. It gives us a lot of flexibility. But they also brought procedural motion after procedural motion to try and get the case dismissed. They didn't want the facts to come out because the facts were so convincing that they were in fact racially discriminating against at least 165,000 children in ways that were separating from their families and that were also contributing to the deaths of some children. So this is finally between 2007 and 2016, we had all these procedural mechanisms and we had the hearings. But we finally get to the decision in 2016. It's a landmark decision. It's the first decision we know of in Canada for sure that held the government of Canada accountable for its contemporary treatment of First Nations kids. It found that they were currently racially discriminating. Not in the past. Governments are always okay with apologizing for the past, but this was happening right then. They were ordered to stop. And government did what it was typical. They welcomed the decision and then they didn't implement it. Well, next slide. But that fortunately is not the end of the story. We were able to bring multiple non-compliance orders against the Canadian government and force them to begin implementing the order. And that has resulted in a doubling of the child welfare funding for First Nations kids in Canada and over $2.2 billion worth of other public services, all a result of the order. So it's totally worth it. But you can, one of the things I want to make a point out of is even before we had effect of those orders, First Nations agencies were actually able, even on less resources, to reduce the number of children in care on reserve. It was on a downward trend before we got even the beginnings of a proper implementation of the order in 2018. And this is something that we want to track more statistically in Canada to be able to see when First Nations kids are served by First Nations agencies versus when First Nations kids are served by the provinces and territories. Because what we're seeing is that when they're served by the provinces and territories, those numbers go way up. And that's where we're getting a lot of the overrepresentation from. Next slide, please. So this has been the results of it. And, there's 770,000 services and products provided to First Nations children between 2016 and 2020. That number is growing. And I need to be clear here that a lot of the credit has to go to the communities and particularly to a little boy named Jordan River Anderson, who's the founder of Jordan's Principle. And Jordan's Principle basically says First Nations kids ought to get the public services they need when they need them. And it was part of the litigation. And his life ended tragically because he was denied those services. The other is we were able to get over $634 million a year in child and family services, mostly for prevention services or for services to reunite kids in care. So all of this has totally been worth it, this litigation. But it's still ongoing. Next slide, please. We actually have a bunch of orders that we're waiting for right now that are under reserve. It's so interesting when I hear the government talk about this case. They'll say things like, well, we're providing Jordan's Principle, and they leave out the part about the orders. Or they say we've done all these investments, or that they'll imply that the discrimination is in the past. But even when they're facing orders that are about to come out. One of the things we were able to do is get prevention money, but we need buildings, particularly in our climate, to be able to provide those services in culturally based ways for kids and families. That's where the capital order comes in. The Canada has already been ordered to provide adequate capital facilities back in 2016 as part of that main legal decision. But it's failed to do so. So we had to bring a non-compliance order to try and get them to actually do that for First Nations families. Canada's also been ordered to pay compensation to the children who were removed and sadly many who were harmed and some who died as a result of their discrimination. Canada has appealed that order, so we're actually heading to federal court to address that. And then there's a couple of other orders that are in the hopper, but I'm not going to go into detail on this short kind of presentation. And when I talk about long-term reform of the program, we're talking also about reform of the government itself. The government has to reform itself. It's a repeat offender when it comes to First Nations kids, first through residential schools, then through the 60 scoop, and now today. And what the challenge we have is not only to roll out the equity for the kids, but to reform the department in ways that it doesn't repeat the discrimination. Next slide, please. And one of the ways we do that is through the Spirit Bear Plan. So this is something that has been adopted by the Chiefs in Assembly, but Canada has never adopted it in true form. That's kind of what they do. But here we go. It's all about implementing the tribunal's decisions, all the legal orders, but also let's stop this pattern where we're addressing the inequalities one drop at a time and one program at a time. Let's cost out all of the inequalities, things like water, housing, education, safe play spaces for kids, health, juvenile justice, child welfare. Let's find out the overall gap and then develop something like a Marshall Plan after the Second World War to address all of them. And that is an important piece. Now, sometimes Canada will use words like, well, change doesn't happen overnight, or you're going to have to be patient. Those are all speeches that continue to perpetuate the discrimination. They imply that they don't have enough money to remedy the discrimination, therefore it must continue. But what I've seen here in Canada with COVID is they are spraying money everywhere. And it's clear that they've always had the financial resources to address this. They've simply chosen not to do it. And even if we just kind of probe that for a minute, even if we assume that they're so broke that their political choice is to pick a racial group of children and give them less than everybody else, clearly that is morally wrong and legally wrong. And yet I think part of the normalization is we get used to these kinds of excuses they offer instead of really unpacking them and holding the governments to proper account. The second thing is to evaluate the government itself. Let's get an independent 360 evaluation of the government. Let's figure out why they don't do better when they know better. And this would be useful not just on children's issues, but on other matters of lands and resources, etc. Many First Nations have already put forward solutions. They just seem to hit a brick wall when they get to government. And we need to help government understand why they're not taking advantage of these solutions and unpack that colonial mentality. Next slide. So, this is the good news in this story is that children of all diversities have been really engaged in this case. They have packed the courtrooms. Jocelyn was there when all the kids came. It was just amazing to see how non-Indigenous children would join with First Nations kids and see the inequality clearly and then want to be active participants in remedying it. So the Caring Society, inspired by these children, have a whole pile of educational tools for kids and engagement things for children. And Spirit Bear is our ambassador for that. But I just wanted to give you a sense of Canada's court record so far. They keep challenging this case and they keep losing too. So this is the record for the kids, and you can see nothing there for Canada. It's kind of like Trump's record on electoral reform. And I'm just going to wrap up here, just one more slide. So you can have, we have actually an animated film that tells the story and honors the children and tells the story about the tribunal and the results that made, and that's called Spirit Bear and Children Make History. And next slide. So this is how to get a hold of us. You can find out all this information online. And I just want to thank you and thank our good partners at NICWA for this opportunity of sharing this a little bit about our case.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Really wonderful overview of what really has been a decades long struggle. I was working at the Caring Society when Cindy, I remember sitting down with you and you said, I'm thinking about launching this human rights tribunal case, and to see how far it's come, not only just in establishing a new precedent for Canada, but the tangible results that we've seen for children through the tribunal orders, including some of the Jordan's Principle work that we've done. So there's still a long ways to go, but I feel encouraged that we've made all of these steps, and it's been not just by standing back and waiting for government to do the right thing, but really forcing their hand through any means necessary to make them do the right thing, right? So thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm gonna hand it over to Helaina Gaspard. I apologize, I live in Ottawa, we're a bilingual city, and that means I have a little bit of a French accent on some of that. So if I'm mispronouncing your name, please correct me. And I see you've got your PowerPoint up, so please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you to NICWA and to the Caring Society for inviting me to join this conversation. So I am one of the directors at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. And so we're a think tank, and we look at questions of public policy, of politics, through the lens of money. And money for us is a tool. Money for us helps us unpack incentives, helps us understand structures, and oftentimes too helps us develop solutions. We were very honored when Cindy and when the Assembly of First Nations in Canada approached us and asked us to help understand the cost and the structure of cost when it came to child and family services in Canada, specifically to help inform a response to the tribunal's ruling on the discriminatory practices for First Nations child and family services in Canada. And so what I'll be talking about today is how we can use money to support reform. Because for us, when we see the world from our little lens, we ask ourselves how, right? How do you help to implement a change? How do you sustain a change? And how do you equip those on the ground with the tools and the resources that they need to be able to do their job, to be able to support the wellness and the well-being of children and families and communities. And for us, that's exceedingly important when we think about it from the perspectives of social justice, absolutely, and also from a fiscal perspective. I will say I'm not a social worker by training, but I have an incredible respect for what so many do on the ground. And I'm really pleased to say we've had the opportunity to learn from a number of social workers and a number of really impressive people from various First Nations and agencies across Canada. And so today what I'll speak to is the work that we've done in response to the CHRT, and certainly at the request of Cindy and the Caring Society and the Assembly of First Nations in Canada. So when we delve into this topic, I'm very much coming to it with that fiscal lens. And so when we're asked to think about and to talk about protection in child and family services and understand costs, for us, the costs are actually twofold, right? We know from all kinds of research in Canada and the US that contact with the protection system has long-term consequences, long-term costs for children, right? As soon as you're in contact with the protection system, you're more likely to experience homelessness, more likely to have substance misuse challenges, to have contact with the penal system, more likely to be incarcerated. So there are a lot of challenges here that result from that contact. And one of the questions we started thinking about was how do you mitigate that, right? How do you address those causes of contact with protective services? And when we were on the ground and we were speaking to those on the ground, the response was clear. The response was, the answers from their perspective, were so apparent that engaging early, engaging with children, and engaging at the level of the entire community is really what makes a difference. It makes a difference in the immediate term, and it makes a difference in the longer term. And one of the most important things, let's say from a purely fiscal perspective, that we came to see was that those benefits, both socially and fiscally, carry through. right? That means that if we can invest early and we can invest meaningfully and we can support children and families early on, the likelihood that they'll do well, that they'll thrive going forward tends to become all the more likely. And this idea of early intervention and of resourcing earlier on and of ensuring resources are commensurate to mandate, that resources are actually there to do the job you need to do, matters a great deal, right? Heckman's studies, Dr. Heckman's studies are famous for this. This idea that if you can break the cycle of poverty and if you can invest early in early childhood education, the benefits extend far beyond the children, but extend to their families as well. And so when Cindy was speaking to the causes of contact with the protection system or those sources of inequity, when we're talking about First Nations children in Canada and certainly other Indigenous persons and other marginalized groups in various countries, these challenges tend to repeat themselves, right? Challenges with respect to poverty, limited or lack of housing, all of these things add up, all of these things build up. And the idea behind this question of early intervention is, how do you get to the root causes, right? How can we start to address the causes of those causes? And so what we've done, just to model what the research suggests about these impacts, is that when you invest reasonably and appropriately in the future, in the current state, those future state benefits from a social perspective can be quite impressive, quite important. But from a long-term funding perspective, those costs tend to become more sustainable. We have a former Prime Minister in Canada who's done a lot of work in his life after politics with Indigenous communities. And when we were speaking to him about this project, one of the things that he always reminded us of was that you're always speaking to two audiences. He said, you're speaking to the people who understand the issue from a social justice perspective. And he said, never forget you're speaking to the people who view this through a crass political or fiscal lens. And we sometimes carry that with us when we're thinking about these questions, thinking through these challenges, and trying to make sure that we can speak both languages, right? Making sure that we're able to address both of those perspectives. And that question of what you do and what that looks like over the longer term becomes quite important. So when we're talking about rethinking the way child welfare is funded, about ensuring that resources connect to goals, we think about it from a public finance perspective. One of the things that we've had the privilege of doing most recently is we've worked with FNCFS agencies and First Nations across Canada to rethink and rebuild a system from the bottom up that would, we expect, respond to needs on the ground and support those delivering the services, those working with children and working with families with the resources and the tools that they need to make decisions in the best interests of the child. So when we think about this program design and how funding should line up, we look at it through the lens of inputs, outputs, and outcomes, right? Inputs are the resources, the money, the people, the infrastructure that's needed to deliver a result. The outputs are the activities and services that you can generate, and the outcomes are the impacts or the results over the longer term. So if we think about funding a child and family services system through these approaches or through these buckets, that means that we need an appropriate amount of money, that we need people who can deliver services on the ground, but that we also have to make sure that we're understanding and that we're tracking in a meaningful way what's happening to children, what's happening to families, and how communities are faring in all of this. So this is about so much more than just the dollars themselves, but the dollars for us are a lens or a tool that we can use to help to trace what's happening on the ground. And most importantly, that question of inputs, outputs, and outcomes has to be framed by particular contexts. Contexts are different, right? Communities are different. Communities have needs, and those needs will differ, the same way the needs of children will differ. So understanding that critical mix of resources that's required to meet the particularities of a context becomes so, so important. And finding that optimal and sustainable mix means that you can help to design and deliver and address challenges over time. And critically in all of this, you need a vision, right? You need this goal, you need something that you're working toward. And in the most recent work that we've done, FNCFS agencies and with First Nations, the vision is well-being, right? There's no more talk of just protection or prevention, but about building wellness, about generating wellness, and about encouraging wellness with children, families, and their communities. From a performance budgeting or from a public finance approach, when we think about how you connect vision, how you connect a goal to resources and to funding, we fall back on what we call performance budgeting. And at its core, performance budgeting is all about aligning resources to desired goals or desired results. And so for us, that means you absolutely need to make sure that resources that you access, that you can access, are sufficient to deliver on your mandate. But resources are just one part of the question, right? The structure, the system that Cindy was referring to earlier, how that money moves, how that money is accessed, matters in some ways just as much as the actual allocation or the amount of money that's being allocated or set aside for that particular policy or program. When we talk about program structure, what we're concerned with is how the money moves and how those on the ground can access it. So is the money moving in a way that's flexible? That's what we want to see. We want to see money that moves in a flexible way so people on the ground can make the decisions to best support the interests of children and can certainly deliver services and programming in a culturally informed way. That's really, really important. And we've seen that time after time again across a number of cases and across a number of First Nations. When you provide flexibility to those service providers on the ground, what you can do with resources is far more innovative, far more impressive, and the results and the impact that you can have tend to be much more immediate because people can problem solve and they can address, they can see, they can respond to the very needs of their communities and the people that they're serving. I wanted to share just a little bit of a comparative perspective when we think about the differences in child welfare. And for me, this is very much a way to help understand and really make real what a funding approach or why funding and the way funding moves matters so much. If we consider Canada's First Nations Child and Family Services, so the FNCFS program, the way the program has been historically funded was by the number of children in care. And before Cindy's work in the CHRT, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rulings, oftentimes agencies had to place a First Nations child in care to unlock the needed funding. And we call that a fee-for-service model. You deliver a service, you are reimbursed for the service that you provide, or you are paid for the service that you provide. That particular model doesn't support well-being. What we heard from the ground was that agencies and those providing services oftentimes found themselves trying to work around the system just to be able to get the resources or deliver the services that children needed in the immediate term. What we also saw from our analysis was that the system, much like the CHRT had identified, was severely underfunded. And we were able, with the help of agencies, we were able to put some costs around those gaps, right? Costs around things like prevention funding, gaps, around considerations like IT and capital. Those are big challenges, especially for First Nations communities that might be isolated or that could be more remote, or that might be the primary point of contact for their community. And so with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rulings and with the analysis and the support of agencies and First Nations, with Cindy's work and a host of others, we've been able to rebuild and think of an alternative approach to help to reset a funding structure that helps to encourage and promote flexibility in the delivery of services and programs that meet the needs of communities. And critically, in the approach that we've been developing, there's a big connection to that question of performance and data. And that for us is a real pivot when we think about public policy and certainly child and family services in this area. That vision, that goal of well-being that was so clearly defined by FNCFS agencies and by members of First Nations communities, we tried to put that in practice. And we identified with them a series of indicators that could be used to help to track and understand the well-being of children of families and communities. And for us, starting to work through and pilot that performance framework, we're working hard with Cindy and with others to help ensure that funding meets the goals of that performance framework. By contrast, I wanted to raise the example of the state of Tennessee. The state of Tennessee was sued years ago for negligence in child welfare. And so the state actually had to reset its entire child welfare system. So what the state did was they actually engaged a performance-based contracting approach. I'm not advocating the approach in and of itself, but I'm raising the example as a really interesting approach and a really interesting way of understanding how money can shift incentives and how money can help to change the way a system operates. So with this performance-based contracting approach, or PBC as they call it, the goal of the system became the permanent placement of children, either by finding permanent homes or through family reunification, right? And so one state official actually described it to me by saying, we stopped buying beds and we started buying outcomes. And so what Tennessee did was they said to all of their service providers in child welfare, we are redesigning the system, and we are going to pay you to meet a particular target when it comes to the placement of children. You'll get your money if you do it. You even have the opportunity to maybe have a bonus if you do this well, but if you don't meet your targets, we're not paying you. And so the result from a fiscal perspective was that it was cost neutral for the state, that the number of children in care were placed in a more timely fashion, and that for one small period, while there was even more money moved and allocated to prevention, the number of children in care in the state actually decreased. That's shifted slightly with a change in governance, but those are really important examples and very important models for us of what funding can do. Again, I'm not saying the system is perfect for all circumstances, but the importance here is that when funding is consistent, when funding is clear, and when service providers on the ground have the flexibility to apply that funding in the best way they can, in the most innovative way they can, to meet the needs of those they serve, we tend to see more effective systems, more reliable systems, and certainly systems too that can help to generate better results for those that are immediately impacted by them. Tennessee also does a lot of work to track and to collect data on how the system works. And it's actually one of the ways, it's that very data that helps to contribute to its metrics and to its performance standards. So an interesting model of how funding and data can work together to deliver alternative results for those that the system serves. So really in brief, when we're thinking about policy and resetting funding considerations, identifying, defining your vision and your goal becomes critical. Making sure that your funding structures and that the program design can support delivery and can support flexibility on the ground is key. Collecting meaningful data that can be used for decision making is a very important ingredient. And we are big promoters of in-course adjustments and correcting, right? Making sure that you check and check again and reset, sometimes at 5-year intervals, sometimes sooner, to make sure that your governance and your accountability obligations are being met. And so that reevaluation of the approach, we would expect would only make it better. So in that, a quick snapshot of how money can be used for problem solving and how funding can be used to change outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helaina. I think this is where we look to partners and to allies to support the work that's happening on the ground, right? I think one of the great benefits and probably part of the reason why this touchstone the touchstones have endured is that, we weren't creating something that never existed before. What we did was we opened up channels to hear what was happening on the ground and to get that frontline reality experience, and then compiled that, documented it, and then amplified it as far and wide as we could. And then it's great to hear partners like you who take that information that you see and are able to put it into a different lens, and hopefully those decision makers who are making the decisions around funding and fiscal budgets and things like that can hear us and can understand things. You've just laid it out so wonderfully in a way that makes a lot of sense. Really appreciate your presentation. So now we have Jack Trope, and I know you have a presentation as well, so we'll give a couple seconds for that to come up. Just as we are waiting for that, folks, if you have questions for any one of the panelists individually or for all of them, start populating the chat box with those questions, and certainly we'll get down to it, and want to utilize the time that we have with these wonderful speakers and experts to kind of gain as much knowledge as we can from them. So with that, I will hand it off to Jack Trope.
Sorry, I had to unmute, so now I have to get my screen back on. Well, thank you, Jocelyn. Appreciate the opportunity to present. And we just start by saying how impressive the work that Cindy and others have done in Canada to hold the Canadian government accountable. Always enjoy listening to the great work that you're doing. And both presentations generated so many thoughts in my head. I just hope I can keep my presentation within the time limits, because there's a lot of things that I hadn't thought about saying that I would like to say after thinking about some of what I just heard. So, but with that, let me move forward and talk a little bit about the United States. So just from a population standpoint, there are about 328 million people in the US. About 6.9 million people have identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. That's self-identification, not necessarily being a citizen of a tribal nation. It's a little over 2% of the population. And about 25% of those folks live in Indian country, which are mostly reservations, but there are other areas that aren't technically reservations. Although many of the people who don't live in, quote, in Indian country live close to the reservation and even, of course, people who are in urban areas are frequently and most frequently very closely connected to their tribal communities. Okay. So just so you understand jurisdiction in the United States, it's complicated. And so for children who live on tribal lands, who are resident or domiciled on tribal lands, tribes generally have exclusive jurisdiction. So a state is not going to have any authority over those children and families. Now, there is an exception to that in certain states back in the 1950s during the assimilationist era. There were some states that were given concurrent jurisdiction over children who are living or resident or domiciled on reservations. So in a small number of states, there is concurrent jurisdiction. And then under federal law passed in 1978, known as Indian Child Welfare Act, which many of you may have heard of even in Canada, the right of tribes to transfer cases for children who are living outside of tribal land back to tribal courts and to have their cases heard in tribal courts was recognized. I'm not going to go into detail. It's not automatic. There's a presumption of the right to transfer, but it doesn't happen in every case where it is sought. And then for a child who lives off the reservation, not domiciled or resident on tribal land, there is state jurisdiction subject to this transfer provision I mentioned, where those cases can be sent back to tribal courts. So in thinking about the role of tribal governments, you need to understand that there's a rather complex set of rules and an extensive tribal interest, regardless of whether a child is living on the reservation or not. Okay. So again, this is the law I mentioned, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, and it recognizes that tribal interest in all of its children and families, no matter where they're located. And so tribes have various rights in state proceedings. They have the right to receive notice of every one of their children who are at risk of placement or have been placed, the right to intervene in cases as a party, and then again, the right to have cases transferred to tribal courts. So very extensive recognition of tribal interest. And I know that's been years in coming in Canada. I will say, I think from a pro-sovereignty standpoint, the Indian Child Welfare Act is possibly one of the most pro-sovereignty laws that the United States has ever passed. Nonetheless, in spite of all of that, we have the same disparities that you see in Canada. Now, these are for state systems, and you can see that the rate of placement for Native American, for American Indian, Alaska Native children is almost 3 times the rate that it is for white children, and even for all other children of color. Now, that's that includes a number of categories. I think if you saw the African American numbers, they would actually be closer to about 10 or 11. So that includes Asian Americans, it includes Pacific Islanders, a lot of other folks as well. But even compared to any other population, the out-of-home placement of Native families is significantly higher, and it's been going up, whereas the other rates of placements have not. So clearly, there's a lot of work to be done to keep Native children out of care in state systems. And this does not include children who may have been placed through tribal systems, and that's not an insignificant number. Okay. So here's how, this is a snapshot of how child welfare is funded in the United States. And I'm not going to run through all of this. I'll just point out a few things. And that is that a lot of the money does come from the Bureau of Indian Affairs historically. So if you look at that, that's probably half of the money. One of the things the United States government did also in the 1970s, which was actually a really good time for Indian legislation, was to allow tribes to contract to take over services from the federal government and to run them directly rather than have the federal government run those services in their communities. And so that's a significant amount of the money that is utilized for child welfare in communities. But there have been ongoing efforts over the years to open up other programs that fund the states in very huge amounts of money, over $13 billion across the country, to tribes. And so there has been some success in doing that. And so Title 4B and 4E are, as you can see, are large programs, as well as TANF, which is our essentially the general welfare program, that those programs have been opened up for direct funding to tribes. And so tribes are now starting to receive money through those sources. Now, I would note that this Title 4E number, the $50 million, that's projected. And I can tell you, I'm fairly certain that not any amount close to that has been generated yet for funding for the tribes. What the difference between Title 4E and all of these other programs is that it's what's known as an entitlement program. So in other words, if some child and family meet certain criteria and the service is provided, then you automatically get a percentage back. It's not subject to appropriation by the government. It's sort of like in the United States, you have Social Security. When you reach a certain age, if you worked a certain amount, you get a certain amount back automatically. It's not based on any kind of government appropriation. So Title 4E falls in that category. So getting tribal access to that was really significant. However, it's been difficult to implement. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about in a little while, is that even when these sources of funding become available, sometimes the fit between those sources of funding and the needs and desires and goals of Native communities isn't always the way it needs to be. And so it becomes harder for tribes to access them. Sometimes the conditions for access aren't aren't positive, and some tribes will decline to even pursue them for those reasons. So it's not just the money equity, it's also that the funding can be used for what the tribes want to use it for. And some of these sources are flexible, but some of them are not. All right. But even so, even though that percentage wise, the percentage that's going into tribal communities compared to population looks pretty good, there's a lot of reasons why it really isn't. One is what I mentioned initially, which is tribes have interest in their children everywhere, and they have a role to play in state proceedings as well as proceedings on their own territories. And what they get funded, it falls far short of what they really need to play the kind of active role that the law contemplated and provided, and yet many tribes are not in the position to take advantage of that and to really have the kind of input into what's going on with their children outside of Indian country that they would like because of inadequate funding. And in addition to federal funding, the context is important too. And we have to understand that when you compare federal funding to the states and federal funding to the tribes, states have enormous tax bases where they can generate a lot of revenue through taxation on property, taxation on businesses, etc. And so in addition to what the federal government's providing, they have all these state resources they can draw upon to supplement the federal funding, and that's how their overall funding is developed. But tribal governments lack that same ability, that same tax base. Tribal land on reservations is held in trust by the federal government for the tribes. They are unable to levy property taxes on their land. They generally don't levy income taxes on tribal members for a simple reason that most reservations have high levels of unemployment and poverty, lack of unemployment opportunities, and so taxing people who are already struggling economically to a significant extent just doesn't make a whole lot of sense and wouldn't generate the kind of revenues the state generates, even if that was something that a tribe chose to do. Tribes do use sales and excise taxes, and some have commercial enterprises such as casinos that provide some revenues. But for most tribes, those tribal sources are not adequate to really support essential governmental services to the same extent as states, certainly, or to the extent that is needed within tribes. And I can tell you that there are some tribes that we have worked with that have social workers with caseloads of 50 or 60 cases that they're handling at any one time. And for those of you who are social workers, you know, I think the standard is about 15. So when you have that many cases, it's very difficult to provide what's needed. And that's even without thinking about the children who are off reservation or outside Indian country. It's federal tax policy makes it harder for tribes to utilize tax exempt financing, bonds, and things like that in the same way that other governments can. And then you do have tax incentives, but for the most part, studies show that they benefit non-Indian businesses doing business in Indian country more than they do to attract new businesses or benefit tribally owned businesses. So, so even again, the policies that are out there, there are some of them not as effective as they really ought to be. Okay. And so here's a important level of funding. This isn't specifically for the child welfare system, but it's for healthcare. And so when we look at the Indian Health Services, which provides health services on the reservation, and we look at per capita spending, you can see Indian Health Services is far less than other sources, and probably the most comparable ones are the Bureau of Prisons and the Veterans Health Administration, because they provide direct services just like the Indian Health Services does. And you can see that the funding for those systems is more than twice as much as the Indian Health Service receives. And so So what does that do in the child welfare context? Well, certainly it affects the availability of prevention services, of treatment services. And so, and as we know, and I think as previous presentations have talked about, those are the ways, those are some of the ways that we keep children out of systems, or that we get children back home if in fact they have been brought into the system. And so that disparity there is pretty striking. And there's been studies done sort of like in Canada for years and years and years, showing that disparity, and it's narrowed a little bit, but it's still pretty substantial. Unfortunately, we don't have a human rights tribunal in the United States that we can go to. I sure wish we did. So I don't want to paint a total negative picture. I do think that there is a increased awareness in Congress of the need to include tribes in programs. And so more and more often we see when Congress passes something, there is money in there for tribes. And so that's I think something that we've been successful at educating Congress about, and I will credit NICWA as being a key player in all of that. My friends at NICWA, but so I think that's where progress has been made, and there's even been progress that's been made in getting them to understand that that tribes approach this work in a different way, or often tribes would like to approach this work in a different way. And I will say one of the things that's troubling is that there are a lot of tribes who have just taken the state system and replicate it within tribal communities, and that's a concern. And I know one of the things that we do when we work with tribes is always try to get tribes to take a step back and say, is this really the system you want? Is this really consistent with your values and your goals? And I'm not saying that they're identical, because they aren't. I think we see tribal systems often prioritizing, for instance, kinship placements in a way that the larger system really didn't do until very recently. And so there are certainly ways in which tribal systems continue to be very different, but they also replicate state systems in certain ways too, and that can be problematic. But in any event, that's sort of a tangent. I'd like to go back to the funding again. I want to give you an example of a well-intended legislative change recently made, which as currently structured is not going to quite achieve what they expected, and then talk a little bit about though how that still might be achieved. So back a couple of years ago, boy, I'm showing my age, 2018, Congress passed something called the Family First Prevention Services Act. And what it did is it opened up that entitlement program that I talked to you about, that Title 40 program, which has always been focused on payments for foster care, for adoption, for administration and training related to out-of-home placement. And it opened it up and said, we're going to open this up for prevention services. And we're going to open it up for mental health services, for substance abuse treatment, for in-home parenting. So big reform that within the child welfare system, to open up the entitlement program and say we need to start focusing more on prevention. And in that particular law, there was a provision mandating that tribes be permitted to operate programs, or they're always permitted, but that programs operated, culturally adapted programs, would be funded by the law. For everybody else, for the states, there's a requirement that these programs be evidence-based and that there be rigorous research underlying those programs. But for tribal programs, there was a recognition that the standards and the way of evaluating those programs might not fit with traditional evaluation methods. There's a practice called practice-based evidence, or community-based evidence, as a way to validate programs that works much better in tribal communities, and that was recognized, which was great. However, it turned out that provision only apply to tribes who are operating this 4E program directly through the federal government. Well, it turns out that out of 574 tribes, only 17 have been approved for that direct funding. And so, and even not all of those have implemented. So only a small number of tribes were really benefiting from this really positive provision around culturally adapted practices in the law. And we have hundreds of tribes that actually access this program through agreements with their states. But under the law as it was drafted, they can only access money if it's an evidence-based program. And unfortunately, right now, on the list of evidence-based programs, there's none that are based specifically on Native cultural values. There are a few that do travel well across cultures, but nothing that's very specific to Native communities. So here the intent was good, and I think continues to be good, but in practice you can see how it makes it difficult for tribes to access these funds in a way that's really meaningful to them. So there are a variety of strategies that people are pursuing to try to fix this. One is to seek amendments to the law to make culturally adapted programming available to all the tribes, and I know NICWA was very involved in all of that. The second is to work to get culturally based programs that have been evaluated, because there are some that have gone through that sort of Western research model, and get them listed as available programs. So they finally, on their next list of programs to review, there's one program that's a Native based program that will be reviewed. So, that's one. That's not a lot, but it's progress. And then, and this is something that we're doing with NICWA at Casey, is figuring programs that could be the subject of research, like positive Indian parenting, which many of you know that NICWA developed many years ago, so that they can be recognized as evidence-based. So we're sort of pursuing all of these different ways to take this well-intentioned change and actually make it meaningful for tribal communities. So I think in a nutshell, when we look at the system in the U.S., the good news is that tribal authority has been recognized for a long time in ways that I don't believe has been true in Canada. But the bad news is that the funding systems, although they are getting better, are still funding available for tribal programs is still significantly less than the need is, significantly less than is available for other programs. And that's even in a country where child welfare generally is underfunded. So the state programs are underfunded as well. The tribal programs are even more underfunded. So continuing to work to get more resources to those programs. And then finally, when those resources do come in, making sure tribes can do with them what they know they need to do to best service their children. And again, I think it's about these outcomes of keeping, I think there's a large movement now that's starting in the United States more generally to try to keep children out of child welfare systems more generally, to focus on prevention, to focus on community-based services, to just not look at the child welfare system to handle all the types of issues that it now handles. That is not only not a positive model, because once you get children in care, the outcomes don't tend to be good for many of those children. To keep them out of the system, to provide community-based services, and to really dismantle the system to a significant extent. And not think of removing children as a solution, but as the rare exception. So we do see that movement happening more generally. I think that's really consistent with how tribal values. And so I hope that we will see the entire system in the US over the next couple of decades move in that direction, and that tribes have the funding and the flexibility and the resources to do those sorts of things in their own community. So with that, I guess it's question time. Thanks for inviting me.
Question time. Thank you so much, Jack, for that overview. I just been noting with our participants list, like how much of an international audience we have, you know, international both in the sense of coming from Canada, the US, New Zealand, but international also in sense of how many nations we have represented here today, all people working from their respective communities. And it's just amazing to see us all coming together, and appreciate everybody's presentations on that. And I just kind of wanted to start with a couple of questions that we got both from the chat, as well as just some that we've received from some folks. There was a question about, you know, how do we evaluate the government? How do we kind of feed that in there? And Cindy offered some really helpful suggestions in there. And maybe I'll ask you to just kind of expand on that. First of all, I can also say for those who have been asking for the presentation, yes, the presentations will be made available, and we're also recording the session. So it will be available on NICWA's YouTube channel. So just follow the National Indian Child Welfare Association. I'm sure we'll have links as well. And sort of the follow-up to that question was, okay, so how do we call for the utilization of a focused evaluation? And so maybe I'll just throw it to our panelists to kind of elaborate a little bit more on evaluating government, and how do we get government to focus on those evaluations and act on some of those outcomes of the evaluation. So maybe Cindy, you could expand a bit more, and maybe I'll look to Helaina and Jack to speak from your perspectives on that question as well.
Well, one of the things we try to do at Caring Society is actually lead by example. So even though we've only been around for 20 years, we've actually had 3 independent evaluations. And currently we're being evaluated by a great group called the Assembly of 7 Generations, which is an Indigenous youth group who's come up with an evaluation framework for organizations on how well they're respecting and engaging with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit youth. So I think one of the things is we also need to evaluate ourselves and have those frameworks in place, and be really interested, I think, and this is where I'm so excited about many of the people who are joining us today, is really being focused on doing right, not being right. And there's a huge difference in that. When you're focused on doing right, you welcome critique, you want to get better, you want to do the best job for kids, and that means evaluation. Too often with governments, they want to be right. And that's where we need to kind of help them do that pattern. I'm hoping the Canadian government will adopt the Spirit Bear Plan, Jocelyn. But even if they don't, I think we need to come up with a framework where we can do an evaluation with the publicly available materials and publish it ourselves. That may mean where we need to go. And in terms of how do you get that change, I think one of the key pieces is think about litigation within the ability to do it, and get it systemic litigation. Make sure that you're focusing on the issue that actually will achieve the broadest change, and that you have good evidence. We don't want to create bad law. And you can talk about that because you've got the legal training to do it. The second important piece, I think, for us to be thinking about is evaluation that really engages the people who are touched by the different kinds of policies, so that it really, it goes beyond storytelling, but it engages those conversations, it engages those recommendations from frontline workers and those who are experiencing it, as well as those who run the programs. And that we look at social movements as being a way to press action. I think, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, March for Our Lives, which has just seen the bankruptcy of the NRA. Those are kind of inspiring examples, and we have our own and we can build on.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Maybe I'll just ask Jack from the US perspective. So the question as it was written was, how can we evaluate government itself? And what are the first steps, and how can this be done from a grassroots perspective? I think it's quite a different situation in the US, so maybe you can speak to whatever you can from there.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a broad question. So there's a lot of different ways I could answer that, but I will say a few different things. First of all, I think state governments are evaluated the federal government, and their child welfare systems are looked at. But one of the things that doesn't happen during that is to really review what's happening with the Indian Child Welfare Act, what's happening with Native kids. That's not a particular focus of those reviews. And so that being done together with tribal nations would be a way to hold those systems more accountable. I do know that organizations like Casey, where I work, that we are doing a lot of deep dives into data to try to see exactly what the causes are for the disproportionate treatment of Native children by these systems. And Cindy mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. Certainly, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of focus on racism within systems. And is that what's causing it? Is it substance abuse issues that are going untreated because they're not the services aren't available? I mean, what exactly are what is causing this to happen, and how do we address that? So I think that's something that it's not so much of a government, it is an evaluation of the government by outside folks, by looking at the data and trying to figure out what's happening. So I think it's some combination of both of those things. But I will also say that I think a lot of tribal nations, they are struggling with also evaluating their own systems and getting their systems to do what they want their systems to do. And I don't want to ignore that, because I think the absolute best way for families and children to have good outcomes is to have really well-functioning, well-funded tribal systems that deal with the vast majority of the children, regardless of where they're located. I mean, if those systems are in the position to transfer back most of the cases involving their children, to make those decisions within their own tribal governments, I think that's a critical way to promote well-being. But in order to do that, your system has to be working the way you want it to, and that's an ongoing challenge, I think, for tribal governments, as it is for every government.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jack. Helaina, do you have any reflections on this question, or anything you would like to add?
Yes, so when we think about the question of evaluation, perhaps linking both Cindy's and Jack's comments on the question, sometimes starting at the level of the organization or at the level of the First Nation can be really quite powerful, because what we see in Canada oftentimes is that there are significant gaps in data, significant gaps in understanding of what's happening at a much more granular level, at a much more localized level. And oftentimes it is First Nations, it is agencies who are best placed, who have the best perspective on the ground, and who can maybe be a really important first step in helping to understand what the baseline is, right? Actually starting to create or develop that floor, helping to understand what that floor is, and then maybe starting to chart ways forward from that really rich information.
Thank you so much, Helaina. I have one last question here, but I did want to add maybe some of my perspectives as well, where our organization is a network of both local and regional offices. And just kind of the follow-up question here I'm responding to is about, do we go, or how do we engage with our MLA, which is a member of Legislative Assembly? Our experience is that it's always great to have the folks who are representing you engaged and knowledgeable about your work. So what we try to do federally, nationally, is whatever we can do, any write-up, even a one-pager, or sharing information on our social media, putting together a short document just explaining the work that's happening and any of the challenges or where things are kind of sticking, and providing that to your local representative, whether it's a member of parliament, a member of legislative assembly, whether it's your local congressman, senator, or governor. anything. What I have found is that those folks always love to hear about what's happening in their writings. And for some of the better ones, that they actually do mobilize that knowledge and bring it forward to their colleagues when those decisions are being made. So it's definitely not a bad thing to do as a part of your regular work, just even a short quarterly report. But then also your Indigenous representatives as well, right? If you have a chief of a community that maybe you're working with children and their tribal leadership, their tribal chairman, somebody who has a portfolio either on council or some of our communities also have regional associations, either for collective of small groups of tribes or First Nations, Métis and Inuit groups as well. There's usually some type of Indigenous representative organization. And I think from NICWA's perspective as well, if I could speak from NICWA, even just having some kind of like input that we can go to and say, this is what we're hearing is happening on the ground. And certainly we can amplify those voices nationally. One of the things when I came into my role was, everything is, and coming from a legal perspective as well, is that, everything's an argument, and having that evidence and having something in hand that we can take to those folks to sort of demonstrate our points is never wasted time. So maybe I'll just offer that as some thoughts for folks to think about. Unfortunately, sometimes it's like one more extra thing to do in your day, but I think it does help in some respect. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I have a final question here. And I just want to maybe ask the panelists if you can really reflect on what lessons we have learned or are currently learning, or maybe even need to learn, either between the US and Canada or respectively, regarding equitable access to child well-being resources. So not just within the current child welfare structure, but either what we're seeing new and emerging, or what we need to do more in the future around access to child well-being resources. So if there's any one of the panelists that want to jump in on that, it's open.
One of the things I think I've been really excited to learn, but also kind of sad to learn, is how structural the reasons are that children come into care. And so if we focus narrowly on child welfare, I think we're missing the opportunity. We really have to look at what are the inequalities that put First Nations families in a position of risk. What disables them from being able to live the lives they wish to have? And then getting at all of those factors. And Jocelyn, that's what came up in the Touchstones of Hope. We started hearing things outside of what we traditionally called child welfare. And those were really critical for children's well-being. And that's why I'm so excited about Helaina's approach of funding towards well-being indicators. Instead of staying in these silos, dealing with children one piece at a time, we really have to take a holistic approach and end discrimination and ensure culturally based practice across a wide domain of areas. And with NICWA and other communities, we're learning how to build social movements and use litigation so the governments are no longer left with the timetable about when this inequality exists. That we will, in peaceful and respectful but effective ways, ensure that the governments implement the solutions that would really end this discrimination and give First Nations, Métis, Inuit families a chance to live the lives they wish to have. No more waiting.
I'll just echo what Cindy just said. I think it's not, you can't just look at the child welfare system. It's everything that surrounds the children's the children and families, whether you call it systems of care, which is something that NICWA has talked about for years, whether you call it a community of hope, which is a term that we use at Casey. It's, if you don't have all of those surrounding everything surrounding that family and child that they need to thrive and do well, that's then you're going to continue to have the inequities and continue to have the issues. It's not just about funding child welfare per se. It's much broader than that.
I think it's very well said, Jack. And I think one of the messages that we've certainly taken away from all of this is the power in sharing those practices and what works, in one First Nation, or a really great program, or very wise practice can certainly be shared and hopefully emulated. And that ability to share those practices, reflect on the learnings, and certainly aggregate that data can end up being really powerful tools for decision making and for change in the ways that funding and structure and hopefully too those evaluation approaches or those frameworks for performance will move forward and best serve children and families.
I really want to thank everyone for your words and your reflections. Everything has been quite amazing, and I want to thank everybody who stayed with us for this time. And just to note that the next dialogue, which will be the third one in the 7-part series, is titled "Touchstones of Hope: Self-Determination Part 1," because self-determination was so much that we had to put it into 2 parts. And this is going to be on March 16th, so put that in your calendar. The timing, of course, is going to change depending on your East Coast, West Coast, whether you're in New Zealand or Nova Scotia. So register for it now. You can go to both the NICWA websites and the Caring Society's websites. And if you want to learn more, legal and legislative efforts for affirming jurisdiction and caring for Indigenous children in Canada and the United States, including available options, rights, and responsibilities, and other considerations for those wishing to assert their inherent jurisdiction over child well-being and child welfare services. So that's just a little snapshot of what we'll be talking about for this next dialogue session on self-determination. And with that, again, miigwech, chimigwech to everyone, and we'll see you at the next dialogue.
Thank you.